Hi, I've noticed that Houdini doesn't have a native curve deformer, so I decided to make one because I need it for something that I wanted to do. And I decided to also make a Norbolt asset. And so this is just a video to go through some of the options of the asset so that I think things get clear because, of course, as you add more options, things get a little bit messy. So in this case, I just have this tube mesh, and I want it to be deformed along this curve. So here I just have some thickness around 0 value, so I can spot it easily. And so this is the asset, and basically in the first input it takes what I want to deform, and then on the second the curve that I want to deform with. So if I activate this, and let me highlight the curve, so I can see here that the curve and the tube being deformed. In this case, it's along the x-axis because it's what is selected here and what makes sense for this mesh that is along the x-axis. But you can choose any of the other two axes. And so basically, the most important parameter here is to choose the center. So basically, there's two parameters in which I choose. Let's say this is my mesh, and this is my curve. And so I choose a point in my mesh that will be the center that I'm going to match to a point in my curve. And so my mesh is defined between 0 and 1 through its bounding box. Or if I have the origin selected, the bounding box option gets grayed out and just uses the origin. So in this case, these thickened polygons here show where that is, where the center is. And on the curve, this also goes from 0 to 1 using the curve U. So basically, these 2 points allow me to place the mesh on the curve. So I have a point in both that allows me to make a match. So let me take off the origin, and so now I can see that the mesh snaps from the lowest bounding box value to the beginning of the curve. So the curve is in here, as you can see. The curve starts here, and so the mesh, if I turn off the origin option, it will also start on the beginning of the curve. Right. So with these two sliders, I can make these two matching positions. So for example, I might want the center on my mesh not to be the minimum value, but the maximum value. And so I'm going to put the maximum value of my mesh in the beginning of the curve. Or I can do the other way around. I want to put the maximum value of my mesh into the maximum value of the curve. So in this case, it will be here. And of course, the axis, so here I can offset with the smooth. I can go even higher, something like this. And there's also a scale. And the scale will use the center defined here. So for example, if I scale this like so, it's going to scale from the highest value in the mesh bounding box. On the other hand, if I put this, let's say to 0, when I scale it, it's going to scale on the minimum value of the mesh's bounding box. So this is just a way to have some strict control about matching the mesh and the curve. Of course, when I click on origin, you notice that this thickened area is the one that is put on the end of the curve. So in this moment, I have this set to 1, but if I put this to 0, this portion here will be matched with the beginning of the curve. So like so. And so if I scale it, it's going to scale from that portion on. Right, so this is when you want to basically preserve the length of your original mesh, but maybe you want to just have whatever mesh you have to go from start to finish along the curve. And so for that, you can just click on Fit on Curve. And so in this situation, from the start to the end of the curve, we have the start and the end of the mesh. And you can still offset it here with the move. So I can come here and offset the mesh. In this case, the offset is not going to be about the length, but it's going to be about the percentage or the curve view. So if I put 1 in here, it's going to put the mesh on the tip or in the end of the curve. Or if I put -1, it's going to put the end of the mesh in the beginning of the curve. So that allows me to do something like this. And the scale still functions. So for example, in this case, I can do this. And so that's why this, while I do fit on curve, this parameter here is all grayed out, but the center curve view is still available because it allows me to choose from where this axis scale happens. So in this case, it's happening from the beginning of the curve. But if I put 1 in here, it's going to happen from the end of the curve. And if I put 0.5, it's going to happen from the middle of the curve, like this. And so that is that. Now let's look into some of the offsets. So here, these offsets allow me to basically add some extra kick to what happens relatively to the curve. So for example, I can have some scaling, or let's say I can move this along the normal. And so for example, let's say I move this by this side. So I have the start and the end. So the start of the curve and the end of the curve, and there's two different values for that. So here I'm going to move this on the normal direction at the end of the curve. Here I'm going to move in the binormal direction at the end of the curve. And so here in the normal direction in the beginning or the start of the curve, and binormal direction in the beginning or start of the curve. And so this is just simple offset. So for example, here I can put, let's say I can put 2 or 3, and I can also scale by 3. And so I get this sort of thing going. I can also roll it or rotate it along the tangent direction. And so it will do something like this. Now, there's this option here called Move Affected by Scale and Rotation. So this means whatever I'm putting in here, I might want to have the scale and rotation to affect it. What this is going to do is that I'm not just going to rotate the mesh, but I'm also going to make it rotate around the curve. It's going to make a little bit crazy effect. So let's say I put 3600. So it's going to look something like this. Now, the issue with this is that I start to, compromise the mesh too much. So one way to use this sort of parameter is to do a second curve. And so instead of deform by curve to this curve with these parameters, you apply what I've applied here to another curve, and then you use that secondary curve to do the curve deform. So let's look into that. So here I have another curve, a second curve. Let's look at that. It's just an array, and I'm going to deform this one by the same curve that I had before. So this curve here, and I'm going to use the same asset for that. Let me just select this in here. And so with those sort of parameters that I had before, I get this spiraling like I had before, but I don't get that nasty deformation, right? So before I got something, let's say like this, but with the curve I just get something clean like this. And so I can use this as the curve that I want to actually use. So let's see, I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to use this curve instead. And so I'm going to reset, so factory revert to factory defaults, and I'm going to put fit on curve. And now I get the same mesh that I had before, the same tube, now fitting into this new CurveDeform. And so I can have the same behaviors as before, but with this resampled curve. Right, so for example, if I come here, let's say I come up here and I start to change this curve. Let's say that I select this point and I start to move this. You can see this change procedurally, which is nice. And so I can also, instead of deforming something, I can, for example, sweep it, and I get something like this. The last thing to notice is the smooth. Actually, there's two things. There's a smooth profile, since these offsets use a value that goes between 0 and 1 along the curve, and I output those two attributes. So U smooth value and just use value. So you can use one or the other. And so the first one is unchanged. The second one is unchanged. The first one is changed by this ramp parameter here. And so as I change the ramp, you notice that those offsets, the distribution of them also changes. So I can put another point in here and control how this transitions. Right, and so actually now the last thing is the resample options. And so the moment this uses a resample node internally, and so here I can choose the type, the amount of resample. So if I just put 1 in here, or let's say 5, or let's say 100, I'm going to start to lose detail, and so that's not great. So as I put some smaller and smaller value, I'm going to get more detail. So it allows you to fine tune the amount of detail you want on the resampling that is done internally, so that you might adapt to the amount of detail that you need depending on what you're working on. So that's it. This is the CurveDeform. Let me know what you think about it. Cheers.